Hello everyone, and welcome to a special super scary edition of 4Panel. I'm your host Andrew, and as per usual, I'm joined by my co-host Rob.
Hello.
But as not per usual, we have a guest star today. It is the man of 1,000 podcasts, Mr. Luke Herr.
Hello, everybody.
That's a very mellow introduction.
Yeah, well, I wasn't sure. I mean, I could have gone in denying that I have 1,000 podcasts, but I'm getting close. I've almost hit 1,000 episodes.
Cool.
So yeah, Luke, I suppose, just for the people listening at home, do you want to give a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Yes. My name is Luke Herr. I am on Twitter as Koltreg. That's Koltreg. For the past few years, I've been doing MultiversalQ, your guide to the comic book multiverse, now in podcast form, which turned into UltiversalQ this year, so we're going through all of the Ultimate Universe comics. But then that also split off into another podcast called Exiled, which is a actual play role-playing game podcast set in the Marvel Universe, and then it expanded out from there, and that is wrapping up this November.
Excellent stuff, and we can probably talk about a little bit more of that later. But for now, the most important fact is, you're a person that knows me.
Yes. You were roommates or just friends with Devin, who was on MultiversalQ and Exiled?
Yeah, I met Devin. He studied in the UK for a year. We became friends, and from there, we met over the, was it Facebook?
I think so.
It was, yeah, because we were part of the group that shared Marvel codes in ways that was probably mostly legal.
Mm-hmm.
It was very definitely legal unless Marvel stated specifically that you weren't allowed to do it, in which case, even then, it was still very definitely legal.
Yes, it's not like there's years of archives that are stuck behind there, said Luke, looking at the group that is still very much open.
It's not like you're stealing them, is it?
No.
And you're not redistributing them to other people. You're just giving people access to the locked vault. Oh my god, yes, it is.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, locked vault. Like some kind of vault of horrors. It's a horror episode. There's the segue. Specifically, today we are going to be talking about how horror has influenced the superhero comics throughout the years. So are we all ready to take this magical train journey into, like, the depths of hell? This is a weird mixed metaphor.
It is. So I suppose we're starting with Tales of Mystery and stuff like that. All those old horror comics that then became
we are
superhero
starting
comics.
even earlier than that, Rob.
Oh, right, okay.
Because horror comics have pretty much been around, I mean, since comics started, more or less in the 1930s. I think there's kind of some debate about when, like, the very first comics are, but certainly the 30s is when they became a regular occurrence. And kind of since those early days, horror comics, they've had their influence on the superhero stories. So you'd get things like Captain America and Namor and the Human Torch. See, a lot of the time they're fighting Nazis, but, you know, maybe sometime the Nazis they've got a vampire or a werewolf. Because sometimes writing stories is hard and you just need to pick a monster for them to punch. But where things really took off was the late 1940s and early 1950s, where we had the launch of EC Comics, who of course famously did a bunch of things like Tales From The Crypt, which long-time listeners might remember from the episode ages back where I got that big Thing From the Grave volume.
Was that the EC Comics Archive, was it?
Yeah, that one. It was just a ton of fun to read. So obviously with EC, they kind of just had a ton of success with their horror series. And this was coming at a time when superheroes, you know, they were kind of on their way out post-1940s. They just were not selling in the numbers that they were originally. So this led to Atlas Comics, which was... So technically, Atlas Comics was the thing in between Timely Comics and Marvel Comics. But if we really want to get technical, which of course I do, the company was still officially Timely Comics, but it was owned by Atlas Comics. And it was the Atlas Comics logo on all the issues coming out. And so that's why we often just call them Atlas Comics, to avoid long-winded explanations like that.
And that was where they were trying out a lot of things, not just horror titles, but you had like romance titles and sci-fi books, which is where the characters who were in Agents of Atlas initially showed up.
Yeah, and that's something I find really interesting, like, about this era of comics, is just this very much like, we are going to try and just anything that works. Like, superheroes, they're not working. Okay, try romance comics, try funny animal comics, sci-fi, horror.
Crime.
Yeah, just throw it all at the wall, see what sticks.
It's interesting you say that, because it's a weird thing that horror has been this thing that's been enduring for most of the 20th century. And I did read that the earliest kind of sequential horror story was around the 12th century. I think it was the 12th century in Japan. It was called Gakizoshi or something like that. Or the Scroll of the Hungry Ghosts.
I think I've heard about it.
I mean, that is a rad as hell sounding title.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those weird things. It was, I suppose, sequential art telling a story is an easy way of, like, passing down folktales, because you don't need words.
And even then, the words can change if it's very much a oral tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. But anyway, back to the 1950s. So some of the ways that Atlas kind of noticeably moved towards horror was, not just horror comics in and of themselves, but also this idea of maybe taking some of their existing superhero properties and shifting them towards horror. And I say shift, I mean very abruptly shift. So Captain America became Captain America's Weird Tales, starting with issue 74. And then issue 75, also Captain America's Weird Tales. Not even any Captain America in it.
Hey?
It's quite weird to see just like the gradual shift from Captain America 73, he's there, bigger, larger than life on the cover. Captain America's Weird Tales issue 74, you've got like Captain America as this tiny little headline, then Weird Tales taking up about like a third of the cover of the comic and the front art. You've got like tiny Captain America just in like the bottom left corner, fighting against giant like Ghost of the Red Skull looming over a castle. And then issue 75, he's not even on the cover or has a story in his own comic.
Wow. That's a quick turnaround, isn't it?
I know, but yeah, but there's so many things from like that era where just characters would have maybe 2 issues of a comic and then they're just gone forever.
So that's where the manga industry learned it from.
Probably.
Well, and also around that time you had the first version of Black Widow, Clairvoyant, who was very much a horror heroine who was fighting the Nazis and banishing them to hell. It was sort of a proto-Spectre.
Yeah, that's right. She was the one that showed up. What's that suit? The 12, yeah, by J.M. Straczynski, like years and years later, where it was a bunch of Marvel's kind of forgotten 1940s heroes.
Mm-hmm.
She was cool. They should do more with her. Anyway, so on the other side of the coin, this is sort of more of a roundabout way that horror's influenced superhero comics. As you mentioned, Rob, a lot of the sort of horror comics launched by Atlas included titles that would like later go on to be superhero series once the genre had turned back around.
Yeah, I think the most famous one is Iron Man.
Sort of. That's Tales of Suspense, which I think was maybe more fantasy and sci-fi.
I had quite a few of the, in fact I still do have them, quite a few of the old Tales of Suspense comics, and they were a mixture of like sci-fi, fantasy, but definitely there was horror in there as well.
Okay, well, I mean, certainly I'll happily take your word for it. But yeah, you've got Tales of Suspense, which is, eventually the first appearance of Iron Man. Then you've also got, in a similar vein, Journey into Mystery, which, was the first appearance of Thor. And Strange Tales, which is where Doctor Strange and Nick Fury debuted.
And Nick Fury debuted in Strange Tales?
Yeah.
I always thought he debuted in a war comic.
Well, okay. Thank you, Rob. You caught me, because that was a thing I made in my notes and thought, yes, I definitely know what this means and will remember that in the show, and then forgot. So Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos was a World War II comic.
Yeah.
Strange Tales was the first appearance of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Okay.
Well, and then also, if you're looking at it from this way, Spider-Man's first appearance in Amazing Fantasy is a horror story that we just get to see it continue. It's literally power fantasy, and then everything turns on him, and he regrets the choices that he's made. Like, that's a straight-up horror fantasy story that you have in there.
It's the Three Wishes thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that kind of monkey's paw type. Oh no, there's unintended consequences to what I wanted. Yeah, I think that's some good foreshadowing, because as we're going to learn later on, Spider-Man has some really fertile ground for just like weird horror stories.
Also, the original's Peter Parker was kind of a tool.
Oh, yeah.
He was the worst. Remember that time he was kind of into Ayn Rand?
Yes. Remember that time he, what was it? He was two-timing on one girl with another girl, and then he ended up ditching them both for somebody else. I think that was the romance storyline.
A bad guy, 60s Peter Parker.
60s Superman was, 50s and 60s, in fact, 40s, 50s and 60s Superman was just as bad.
If anything, 50s Superman was just the worst person.
It was very much the editor working through a lot of his issues and people being forced to go along with it. The Lois, I made you fat without telling you about it. That way a mobster wouldn't be able to find you, because fat women look totally different. Or, I have a lion head, because I need to teach you a lesson. Very much cruel omnipotence.
Is this in the same way that the creator of Wonder Woman was also working through his issues?
Different issues.
Yeah. Hey, speaking of people with issues, I think this is a great way to segue into what happened at the end of the 1950s. Well, kind of midway through the 1950s initially. Frederick Bloody Wortham, who, if that name is unfamiliar to listeners, he published a very famous book called Seduction of the Innocent.
Wasn't that mid-50s, 1954, I think it was?
It was indeed 1954.
Mm-hmm.
Right, well remembered.
It's kind of a black mark in comic book history, isn't it?
Yes and no. I mean, Wortham is a highly complicated figure to be reduced down, because he was a psychologist who, in the 40s and 50s, was working with African-American communities at a time where they didn't have access to mental health, and he was choosing to work with non-privileged youth, and he was doing a lot of research. But yeah, he came out with Seduction of the Innocent, which was basically, comics are going to turn your children gay, which is a bad thing. They're going to corrupt your children with signs of vice and turn them into violence, and it's not great for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, and especially because a lot of the research, from what I understand, it's this very much, okay, here is a child who is a juvenile delinquent. They also read comics. Therefore, comics are the cause of juvenile delinquency.
Why does that argument sound so familiar? Here are kids who do violence. They play video games that are violent.
Yeah.
Once someone opened that little Pandora's box, we never really escaped, did we?
Yeah. Luckily, that's the only bad mistake humanity's ever made and then never ever learned from.
Definitely. It's not like we've had video games like Mortal Kombat and the same figures recurring again and again.
All this bad.
We're just circling the drain now, aren't we?
Kind of.
Anyway, Seduction of the Innocent. Also, I do want to say, I didn't actually know about all that stuff with kind of desegregation in schools before you sent me that, Luke, and that is very interesting.
Yeah, it's very easy to try and paint people as these black and white figures of good or bad, and well, he did do really unscrupulous things. It was very much parents in a panic going for this, and then the comic publishers who weren't doing horror and crime books really wanted revenge because their sales, like you'd mentioned, were slipping, and as more readers who were like coming back from the war were looking for something that wasn't superheroes to sort of cope with PTSD and like trying to find books that reflected their lives at the time, comics getting considered to just be something for kids led to sales numbers dropping from people who had the money to buy comics. And so you actually, before the Comics Code Authority, which I think we'll get to in a second, they already tried creating the Association of Comic Magazine Publishers in 1948, and that was focused on just stopping crime comics, but then they led to the Comics Code Authority, which, if you want to take over from there.
Yep, that is a good lead-in. So, yeah, as you said, Seduction of the Innocent, the book kind of inspired a lot of panic in parents, which eventually led to a kind of Senate subcommittee investigating all of this and coming up with the Comics Code Authority, which is basically a list of very harsh rules on what can and cannot be published in comics, which specifically for the purposes of this show did a lot to really basically hamstring any attempts to write horror or just even horror-influenced books. Because, I mean, Luke, you've sent me some of the specific rules, and they include things like no comic magazine shall use the words horror or terror in its title, scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited, which kind of doesn't leave you a lot of wiggle room horror-wise.
It leads to weirder horror, because that's where you get a lot of the Batman fighting aliens and Superman having to deal with his emotions in very weird ways.
I was literally about to jump in there, Luke, and you said it perfectly. I was about to say, no, I witnessed Japan going through this with their horror manga. That's how we end up with Junji Ito. The Comics Code of Authority is literally how you end up with characters like Junji Ito making comics, because they will avoid all of the normal stuff and just do crazy, weird things.
And, like, one of the things that never gets caught up is, or one of the things that never really gets brought up, is these comics were over the top with their violence and bloodshed. Like, it was not for the purpose of storytelling. It was literally, oh, this sells well, we're just going to fill the books with it because it sold well. It's excess for success.
Yeah, this is true. I mean, I think kind of one of the most famous issues, kind of the cover, is like the prime example of this, is where it's a guy like holding a hatchet and some woman's like severed head. And it's like pure shock value.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that like got brought up in the case that led to the Comics Code Authority, where they asked the publisher to defend it. And from the stories that I've read, he was horribly sick at the time, looking sweaty, not feeling great. He basically came up and tried to explain, yeah, it's a good cover for a horror book, but it came out more as, oh yeah, I think this is a fine cover, which is a very different thing.
Yep.
Yeah, I get there's a lot of difference between this is good horror and yeah, this is fine.
Wow.
But yeah, so for a pretty long while, like a good couple of decades, that was kind of pretty much it for horror and superhero comics until say the early 1970s. I think it was even 1971, where the CCA finally relaxed some of its rules, specifically around the use of kind of classic horror monsters. because I think it was things like vampires and werewolves. They were considered like literary figures, and so it was all right to use them in books.
Yeah, one of the arguments I was presented was, hey, these rules are restrictive and ridiculous. Frankenstein is a classic, everybody agrees on that. We couldn't make a Frankenstein comic, and so it was like, oh, okay, well, if there's a literary background, we can use it, which was where you got like your Tomb of Dracula and your Frankenstein and your Werewolf by Night. But then the weird thing was zombies were still banned because there was no American, European literature around them, so they just turned to using Zubimbies, which was a Robert E. Howard term for a while to get around that.
See, that's wild, because that's kind of one of those things I've never really considered. That, like, obviously, zombies aren't, like, actual classic horror monsters.
Well, it depends on the zombie. If you're going with the modern definition of the zombie, then no, it isn't. But if you're going with...
No, I mean, like, the George A. Romero brain chompers.
Yeah. If you're going with them, then I'd say no, they're not classic literary monsters. But if you're going with kind of the voodoo ones, then I do know that, I think it was Byron wrote a story that involved voodoo and had a zombie in it. So...
the white zombie, I think?
I think it was that one, yeah. I can hear Furious typing.
The sound of research.
I'm not familiar with that Simon and Garfunkel song.
Yeah, as Luke kind of alluded to, once these kind of new rules have been put in place, comics, and especially Marvel, like, really jumped on this new opportunity to publish a bunch of horror-based titles. I mean, like, we had, Tomb of Dracula, Werewolf by Night, Ghost Rider, Son of Satan as well.
And how is Ghost Rider a classic literary monster?
He's, all those classic stories. Think.
Well, and the other...
Do you not remember Shakespeare's "Look upon this man, his head iseth on fire, and he has a kick-ass motorcycle"?
Well, and he fit the other changes in what you could do with comics because he was a monster who punished the guilty. It wasn't him lascivious, violently attacking innocent women and making them also pose sexy. That was the big thing, because you also, around that time, had the lift on what you could do as far as drugs. And the conversation changed because it was like, oh, we can't present a pure black and white world anymore because that's more fantastic than Frankenstein's and Dracula's.
Yeah, this was definitely like the era where anti-heroes started becoming a thing. Like, obviously, you had these kind of horror characters, and then you had like the likes of the Punisher as well. And also a fun example, who I didn't realize at first, Morbius, the Euro trash vampire. He was actually technically created just before these rules changed.
You mean Morbius, the living vampire, legally distinct from a vampire.
Exactly.
That's why he wants that plasma, not blood.
That's a big move by Marvel, just saying, it's okay, science made him a vampire, he's completely different, and therefore, does not apply to these rules. Now watch as he bites people in the neck and sucks out their plasma.
Well, and in a way, that whole trying to find ways around it and explaining things with science also led to, the strangest take on Swamp Thing that there was, where it's like, oh, he keeps his memories of what he eats, like planarian worms, and then 10 years later, that science got debunked because it was literally, oh, these worms aren't following because they've eaten dead worms and have their memories. Nobody was cleaning the maze that they were going in to look for food, so they just knew which paths to follow.
That's pretty good. Do we want to briefly talk about how at pretty much the same time we got Swamp Thing and Man Thing?
The books made by two roommates?
Yeah, what a coincidence.
They didn't... According to the official stance, they didn't influence each other at all.
Yeah, I think Luke, you shared a quote from Len Wein that I can read out if you want.
Or I can read out it if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I dislike doing anything that requires any effort, so go ahead.
Haha, British ingenuity. Gary and I thought, unconsciously, the origin in Swamp Thing #1 was a bit too similar to the origin of Man-Thing a year and a half later. There was vague talk at the time around Marvel of legal action, but it was never really pursued. I don't know if any letters ever changed hands between Marvel and DC. We weren't happy with the situation over the Swamp Thing #1 origin, but we figured it was an accident. Gary was rooming with Lynn at the time and tried to talk him into changing the Swamp Thing's origin. Lynn didn't see the similarities, so he went ahead with what he was going to do. The two characters verged off after that origin, so it didn't make much a difference anyways. 'Cause Lynn Wein wrote both the second Man-Thing story and then the first Swamp Thing story, but that first Swamp Thing story came out before the second Man-Thing story did. Publishing.
Yeah. Also, Len, come on. Don't see the similarities between the two.
There was a lot of drugs going on in New York at the time.
Yes.
That's a very fair point. Anyway, the punchline is that actually there's a character from like the 1950s called the Heap, who is basically exactly the same, and they both ripped him off.
Yeah. Gary Conway was actually a fan of the character and worked with the editor to make a copy of that character.
Wow.
Yeah, it's mad. It's like he was created by Harry Stein and Mort Leave for Hillman periodicals. And like, you look at the covers, and it's literally just Swamp Thing. Like, it's a big green mossy man.
I've always had a soft spot for Swamp Thing.
I mean, to be fair, he himself probably has lots of soft spots.
Have you told Luke the story about the giant-sized man thing and the amount of fun we had with it?
Oh, who doesn't love Giant-Sized Man-Thing?
That sounds very wrong now that I've said it.
No, I love when Giant-Sized Man-Thing appears, like in that issue of Thunderbolts.
I, an adult in my 20s, have walked up to actual professional comics book man Chip Zdarsky and said that I was disappointed that he couldn't fit in any more commissions because I would love to see his giant-sized man thing. And that's why I'm not allowed at conventions anymore.
Ah, that explains the restraining order.
The last bit is a lie. He laughed a lot. It was okay.
Good. Ah.
But yeah, so I think a character I find really interesting, he wasn't necessarily created in this era, but it was kind of, I think this era is what best defined him, is the Spectre.
Yes.
So he is a character originally created in 1940 by Jerry Siegel and Bernard Bailey, although there is some debate about how much Bailey actually contributed to the original idea. So he is a man called Jim Corrigan, a detective who gets killed by the mob and comes back as a kind of a vengeful spirit, a spectre, if you will.
Isn't that the tagline, Spirit of Vengeance?
Yeah, I think certainly some of the books have been like subtitled that. And originally he could just kind of do vaguely ghosty things, like he can float and walk through walls. And his main thing is like turning criminals to skeletons with his eye beams. So obviously that's the kind of thing that got stamped down on a lot by the Comics Code.
Very Fletcher Hanks.
I do not know who Fletcher Hanks is.
Oh, he made Phantoma, and I'm forgetting the other big character who he had. Yeah. So there was Phantoma, who was very much an early horror heroine. But he also did Stardust the Super Wizard.
Oh.
And like Space Smith and like Stardust and Phantoma are the big ones, but they were sort of these very stream of consciousness. Oh, you think you're the head of this crime organization? Well, I'm going to make your body disappear, and you'll just be a big head.
Yeah, that kind of ironic punishment style of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. So like I was saying, the Spectre, he was gone kind of for quite a while the CCA was in effect. I think it would mostly pop as kind of like a narrator and things, kind of vaguely supernatural tales. but he got brought back in a bigger way in 1975, who, once again, in a case of an editor having some issues to work through, Joe Orlando, who worked at DC, got mugged, and so became very interested in this idea of a superhero who's just like this very wrathful personification of revenge. So Spectre, he appeared in the anthology title Adventure Comics, in stories that were kind of dictated by Orlando and then written up by Michael Fleischer and drawn by Jim Aparo. And so the thing I find interesting is because this was a period where under the code you can have, a character who's like a ghost, but you can't, have him like just murder people on page. So to get around that, they came up with the arguably far more terrifying idea of, what if he just turns people into inanimate objects and horribly dismembers them? And that's bloody terrifying.
Yeah.
Or someone's fetish.
Or both.
Wow.
But yeah, examples include, like, turning a mobster into a big chunk of wood and chopping him up with buzzsaws, turning another guy into glass and shattering him, freezing a guy in a big block of ice, and my personal favourite, going after a mobster called Ducky, who has an adorable pet duck, which the Spectre then makes into a giant Godzilla duck, who eats him.
Well, that kind of answers whether you'd want to fight 100 duck-sized horses or one horse-sized duck.
But also you could befriend the horse-sized duck and just ride it about.
Mm-hmm. Assuming that you don't have the wrath of God coming after you.
Exactly.
And to be honest, if you do, you don't really deserve a duck, do you?
No. And actually in 2010 there was a really good short animation that DC put out with this version of the Spectre, because I think it wasn't too long afterwards, like, oh, now the Spectre is actually the incarnation of God's wrath, and he's only going to get involved if things are really big. And yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, didn't they kind of cue that up, though, years ago when they did the Amalgam Age of Comics, when DC and Marvel did their big crossover during the 90s? Because I do remember that when the whole thing with the two brothers fighting each other and throwing realities at each other, that was the backstory, if I remember correctly. And it was the Living Tribunal on Marvel's side and the Spectre on DC's side who basically merged the two universes together.
Sort of. I mean, it was also Axel Asher.
I do remember that there was this big 2-page spread of the Tribunal on one side with his arm out and the Spectre on the other side with his arm out, and they had their arms grasped against each other, and then they had all the different heroes kind of spread around this. It was, the Da Vinci painting of God touching Adam. Mm-hmm. That sounds very wrong, but you know what I mean. Moving on. But it was kind of like that.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. We covered that for like the 50th episode of MultiversalQ or something like that, when we did all of Amalgam.
Yes.
My favourite thing is that the Spectre appeared in Batman the Brave and the Bold, a cartoon for children.
Mm-hmm.
And then he turned Joe Chill into a block of cheese and had rats devour him.
Like you do.
That's not child appropriate.
Wow. I forgot about that.
Anyway, basically to wrap things up, kind of from the 80s and onwards, the CCA pretty much stopped being of any relevance whatsoever. And so we started getting a lot more horror in comics. Not just characters inspired by horror stories, but also kind of conventional superheroes in more horror-themed stories. I know, like, one of the big examples for me is Kraven's Last Hunt, the Spider-Man story.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, yeah.
Where it's just this really weird, like, story of death and rebirth and a man who eats so many spiders.
They're tasty.
And the entirety of Marvel Zombies wouldn't exist in the modern era if the CCA was still running.
I think Marvel Zombies is interesting because that's like a superhero-based series written like entirely by someone. That someone being Robert Kirkman, who's like their claim to fame is being a horror author.
Mm-hmm. Well, now it is.
I think that's a very good example Yeah, nowadays. At the time when he wrote it, I think that was probably... Well, I think that was kind of the point, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, that and spinning off from Ultimate Fantastic Four.
Oh, yeah. I always forget that that's where they first appeared.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have that quite fun fake out where, like, it looks like it's the 616 Fantastic Four. And then actually, no, they're just zombies.
For me, the biggest example of horror in comics now would easily be the Immortal Hulk.
Rob, you have not seen the notes, but literally the end note is discussion of our personal favourite horror-related superhero stories and why it's Immortal Hulk.
So go with it. I've just queued you up.
Because it's so good.
Yes.
It is. That is like one of two books that has actively disturbed me as reading. One of three books that has actively disturbed me as reading as I was reading it. I think the other was like the Hellboy, the Crooked Man miniseries, which has fantastic...
Oh, God, the Crooked Man is such a freaky guy.
Yeah. And then The Filth, but The Filth for totally different reasons.
See, I approach it from the other direction. I've read quite a lot of horror manga. And so for me, when I come into Western comics and read horror, it just seems kind of tame. But then Immortal Hulk is everything I love about horror comics, just in there with all the. I think you phrased it best, Andrew. You said the Hulk was kind of twisting out of Banner. I love that turn of phrase because it fitted the image completely.
Yeah, it's a good phrase, but I also feel like I've made myself deeply uncomfortable saying it.
Fair. Out of curiosity, are either of you reading Strike Force right now from Marvel?
Yeah, I have read the first issue. God, I kind of wasn't sure about what I felt about it.
The second one is a lot stronger, but it deals a lot with, like, fairy horror and, sort of the dark side of fairies where it's not all just rainbow wings, and it's also sort of gets back to the whole Simonson idea of dark elves and how they will literally completely destroy you, and then if you ever try and get back, you will be dead forever.
Is this the Strike Force that was part of, like, the War of the Realms?
No, this is a spin-off that came out of that.
All right, okay. I haven't read it, but I do know about the fairy thing. You mean the stealing babies and things like that?
Yeah, and like if you eat their food, then you become one of them, and yeah.
You can't come back, which actually is an offshoot of the old Greek myth about Hades, when Persephone goes to Hades and gets kidnapped by Hades, I should say, and eventually she eats the pomegranate seeds and has to stay in Hades for 6 months of the year.
I think that's more of just bad branding on Hades' part, because, I mean, Hades was such a basic dude. Cerberus translates into Spot. He named his three-headed dog Spot.
Oh, yeah, that was the ancient Greek way. I mean, Theseus, Perseus, they literally just mean killer, or words to that effect. That's all they mean.
Ancient Greeks, bunch of nerds.
No, they're just very basic.
I'm really advanced.
Oh my God, they're all Asgore from Undertale.
Yes, they are. They're really smart, but also very dumb when it comes to naming things.
Anyway, I think we are probably getting near the end of things. Just to close this out before we go, I'm going to mention as well, DC do some really great horror stuff. Specifically, the thing that pretty much kicked me off wanting to do this whole show, they released an anthology, Secrets of Sinister House, a few weeks ago. And that's very good. Like, there's one incredible story about the Atom, who just, like, shrinks down into a corpse and meets this, like, entity known as Old Worm. And it's really cool because, like, the Atom is one of those characters I would never think of for, like, a potential horror character, but actually works really well.
Yeah. What about just horror comics in general? What would you recommend?
I mean, look, I'm going to recommend Hellboy, as anyone who has ever listened to the show will know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you just say Hellboy or also B.P.R.D? Because I think B.P.R.D is scarier because you know those characters don't have a title book. So you can have awful things happen.
That is a very good point.
Because...
Yeah, I think, like, if we are recommending purely on the basis of, like, which is scarier, then yeah, I'd probably go with B.P.R.D.
Hmm.
Because I think Hellboy is more kind of contemplative, is the word I'd use.
It's gothic horror. It's very much about the histories of things, while B.P.R.D. oscillates between the types of horror that it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely better at doing like a lot more visceral stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How about you then, Luke?
So not quite spooky all the time, but there used to be a annual Halloween anthology called Boo that was put out on Comixology, and it was a number of different teams of writers and artists coming out. There's like 8 or so issues of it, and a lot of that was really top notch. There was also weirdly enough, a Christmas spinoff for it as well. But if you're looking for something different, check out Boo. I recommend it.
Nice.
I'm going to go with if you're looking for something different, I'm going to throw Lock and Key out there because I thought you would have already recommended that, Andrew. I'm not going to go with that one though. What I am going to go with is Beasts of Burden.
Also a very good shout.
Because Beasts of Burden, I remember when they did the Dark Horse horror anthology, and that was my first introduction to Beasts of Burden. I can't remember which episode we covered it on, but I waxed lyrical about Beasts of Burden from then on. And I think that was around the same time that I read Warren Ellis, Rover Red Charlie?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely remember you comparing the two.
Yeah, and Beast of Burden just has become one of my all-time favorite horror comics. Horror from the perspective of dogs, and the dogs are protecting the world.
They're very good boys in a very bad world.
They are very good boys, and they can do magic as well.
Anyway, I think that probably does us for this segment of the show. Luke, thank you for being on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Glad to be on.
And before you go, is there, would you like to tell people again where they can find you? Maybe talk about any unfeasibly large podcast projects that you're wrapping up?
Yeah, so beyond UltiversalQ, and I also forgot to mention RPG Pals Club at the beginning, which is a D&D actual play in the Waterdeep setting, which you can find at rpgpals.club. UltiversalQ is at UltiversalQ or multiversalq.com. Exiled is the big one. We are wrapping up in November, and one of the things that we are doing is a series of 12 one-shots featuring different teams going up against the overarching late-term enemy of the show, the Britannic Empire, sort of the imperialism incarnate. That Exiled is a show that has had a very diverse cast would be fighting against. And so each of these one-shots is a different 4-person team. Most of them new characters. There's a few returning teams in there going up against big baddies. And all of them are incredibly different. And most of them don't require any previous knowledge of the show because it's literally, oh, we need to throw together a character for this? Yeah, that's fine. And you get all sorts of results out of that, and you can find that at exiledpodcast.com.
Nice. I know I'm certainly looking forward to the return of the Starjammers, my favourite Exile team.
Oh, that is a good one, and there's plans post that for another Starjammers return.
Oh, good, because I was also going to ask, I know this is the end of Exiled as a regular podcast, but I believe there's going to be some things in the future.
Yeah, I've been doing a podcast with 5 people who I've needed to edit down as a weekly show for coming up on 3 years now, which nobody in the cast is in the same position they were when they started. Only 2 of the people who were on the show at the beginning are still there. So with that much change, we've decided to wrap up the show, but through Patreon support, we are going to be funding additional episodes. So if we can get up to $80 a month, which is about $14 US away, we'll be doing 2 backer episodes annually. And I was actually sharing a bunch of the pitch ideas that I had last night because there's a lot of stuff that I am excited about. Planet of Gorilla Man, Fiendish Plot of Dr. Nemesis. Lots of good stuff coming up.
Those do sound very good. Well, best of luck, and I hope to hear more from Exiled soon.
Yeah, thank you all for having me on.
Thank you for coming on.
And now I guess we'll go for a break and then be back later with some reviews. Transition sound effect.
Transition.
I am so leaving that in.
Heck yeah, now we don't need to pay royalties on anything.
I'm Christopher Sabat, the voice of Vegeta, Piccolo, Yamcha, and a few others on Dragon Ball Z. And the Geek Show is over 9,000!
Have you ever been reading through a stack of comics and thought, maybe I should see what this Arkham Asylum game is all about? Or been playing Marvel vs. Capcom and felt like you were at a real disadvantage since you didn't know who half the characters were? Well, Play Comics is the show for you. I'm Chris, and each episode we take a look at video games based on comic properties and how well they stick to that source material. So whether you know the comics and want to know how all these games work, or you know the games and want to find out where all this craziness came from, go check out Play Comics at playcomics.com or wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
And welcome back. We have split apart the Salt Circle, keeping Luke here, so now we can go on to reviews. So, Rob, do you want to kick things off?
Yes, and I'm going to kick things off with Lightstep, which is by Milos Slavkovic and Mirko Topalski.
Oh my god, did we do an accidental pun?
I don't know. Did we?
Because kicking things Lightstep.
Oh god.
This really is the cursed Halloween episode.
I didn't even notice the accidental punnage. Oh, wow. I'm getting old. But anyway, yeah, so this is written by Milos Slavkovic and Mirko Topalski and Ivan Brankovic, with art by Milos Slavkovic and colours by Milos Slavkovic and HMT Studio, and letters by Andre Bunjak, something like that. Anyway, Lightstep is, I suppose, a science fiction story, but it's the kind of science fiction story that you got when people didn't really know how science worked. So we're talking like not so much Jules Verne. We're talking more the E. Doc Smith, early Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov type science fiction.
Okay, right, so not your Jules Verne accidentally guessed like half the inventions of the modern age science fiction.
But the kind of weird, outlandish science fiction where, you remember Clarke's third law, any sufficiently advanced technology will appear as magic to a more primitive people, or words to that effect.
Indeed. This is actually like the second time this week I've mentioned Clarke's third law to someone.
Cool. So, this actually starts off on the Bloodliners plane, which is a bizarre place, right? Where you have a bunch of people who are genetically, scientifically, religiously, technically they're all inbred, but not. But they are. Because...
So like they're all split off from the same genome type
From
thing?
the same genome type thing, yeah. And in this place, you have a young lady called January Lee, who is one of the families. And all of these people are descended from the primogenitor, who she dreams about in her seizures when she has them. And there's a whole story about the primogenitor, about his brother and his sister, how his sister killed his brother, and how he cut off his sister's head in a fit of rage, and how he then, in his madness, killed off all his family and became the only one of his bloodline. But then, through gene splicing and an extended, endless orgy, they call it, and gene splicing, created 100 perfect offspring who shared his bloodline, and then he sent them off, and then all sorts of rebellions happened. And so the Bloodliners plane is the closest plane to light speed, to true light speed, the only one above the Bloodliners plane is the Alpha Regions plane. Now, in this book, the whole idea of planes is quite interesting. The way they do it, it's like a caste system, so the slower your planet is traveling, the lower you are in the caste system, and the faster your planet is traveling, the higher you are in the caste system. So the Bloodliners plane is traveling at almost light speed. So in a day for January Lee could be the entire lifetime of somebody living in a lower plane. You see?
I see the logic behind that. That's actually really neat. I like that.
Yeah, which is where it... See, that's one of the things I love about this. It's got some really interesting concepts, some really interesting ideas. And you have a planet full of religious fanatics who all believe in the primogeniture and all believe in the sanctity of their bloodline, and that anyone else with a different bloodline needs to be destroyed or enslaved. And so things happen, and January gets exiled, only to end up in the ship of a guy called Samson, who looks very familiar but also isn't, and also suffers under a curse himself, which you kind of get hints of as the story progresses. You have a 6-armed bug type thing called Dada, who is obsessed with cutting off people's gonads, and they are one of the enemies that January and Samson have to face in this. And this kind of spins out into this really interesting, really vibrant, and really colourful story, the likes of which I haven't seen for a while. I mean, the closest I've seen anything to this was the republished Valerian stuff we received to cover.
Yeah, actually. This does sound like quite a Valerian-esque plotline.
Yeah, I mean, you have...
Valerian in the plane of 1,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, you have January Lee, who's having these... who basically has this genome that allows her to travel for a split second in the right kind of environment and with the right equipment. She can travel for a short period of time at near light speed. But you also have, on a planet that is very much like Earth, a radio player that Samson has been intercepting for a long time now, which is accurately describing the future and is telling the story of his adventures before his adventures even happen.
Weird.
Yeah, it's one of the subplots on this. His crew call themselves radio pirates.
I mean, because why wouldn't you? That's a hella cool name.
Yeah, and you have a planet where the entire population is convinced that the end times are coming, and so you have these priests who lock themselves away. They cover themselves in all sorts of things. They lock themselves away behind masks and earplugs and lock themselves in a sarcophagus.
Oh my god.
Yeah?
Because it's like pirate radio.
Did you just get that?
Look, my brain's been fried from horror comics, Rob. It's not my fault.
Anyway, these priests, they can control gravity, but they lock themselves away in these sarcophagi because they're convinced the end times are coming and that the universe is lying to them. And the entire planet thinks like that. It's crazy and also glorious and colourful, and the female characters are a bit... I mean, they're a bit... Well, how do I phrase it? They're drawn a bit, would you say, Europeanly?
Yeah, in the kind of Euro comics.
Have to make them sexy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of thing. I suppose there's a place for it, but I would have liked the art to have been a bit more utilitarian. Some of the costumes are a bit too figure-hugging. It just reminded me of, 90s comics and how they approached costuming for the female form, where it looked like it was just painted on.
Yeah, it's annoying that in quite a few places we're still not really past that.
Yeah. But in terms of the story, it's got some great ideas. It's got some really interesting approaches. It's got some really interesting characters. I absolutely adore 66. 66 is a colony that lives on the ship and is basically like the ship's AI assistant type thing, but it's actually a colony of beings.
Oh my god, hive mind AI.
Thing is, it's not an AI. They're like organic creatures that were Samson rescued from a planet, and they live on his ship, and they basically do all the legwork on the ship and everything like that. And they're his companions, and they have a leader and all sorts. But they're also kind of a hive mind as well.
Oh, so it's like they've infested the ship, and you can communicate with them, and it's kind of turned it into like a bio ship.
A little bit, yeah.
Damn it! Why are we getting so many good books in? I want to read them all, and I don't have time to.
So, yeah, I mean, this has got so many great ideas like that, and yet this is only the first volume.
Damn, that sounds good.
Yeah, it's got some great ideas, some really interesting action, some really interesting plot twists as well. And it does raise a lot of questions, but those questions really make you want to continue reading. So, Lightstep, I recommend it. Aside from some chancy artwork at times, it's really good.
Nice. So over to me then to wrap things up.
Yup.
So, I figured since I was talking about earlier, I may as well cover Hellboy and the B.P.R.D. 1956, which was written by Mike Mignola and Chris Robertson, with art by, for the main story, Mike Norton, Yishan Lee, and Michael Avon Omeg, and for Hellboy vs. Lobster Johnson, The Ring of Death, the art is by Mike Norton with colours by Dave Stewart, and for Down Mexico Way, the art is Paul Grist with colours by Bill Crabtree. So this continues the Hellboy and the B.P.R.D. series. It's, I think like we were saying earlier, with kind of there being differences between the series, I find it interesting that this one is less horror and more kind of like political intrigue. So it's almost like all the backroom dealings and like sort of Cold War shenanigans going on behind some of the earlier Hellboy stories.
Ah, yes.
Or I guess like chronologically earlier. So this continues the plot of kind of Professor Trevor Broom kind of going up against the, what are they called? The Special Science Service, who are like the Russian equivalent of the B.P.R.D., both groups of which are now like in an arms race to try and gather this mysterious substance known as Encaladite. Meanwhile, Susan Zhang, the psychic member of the B.P.R.D., is getting horrifying visions of the future, which may be familiar to anyone who's read the main B.P.R.D. main B.P.R.D. series. And Bravara, the head of the SSS, is growing more and more unstable as her superiors maybe begin to plot to do something about her, which, I mean, it's kind of a foregone conclusion, seeing as when she's like appears in the main series, she's locked inside like a weird glass vase thing.
Okay.
Hey Rob, do you know who I didn't mention in that summary?
Who?
Hellboy himself.
Actually, yeah, you didn't.
Do you know why that is, Rob?
Is he not in this?
He sort of is, but as I said, this is 1956. And do you know what happened in 1956?
The Comics Code of Authority?
Nope. Well, yes. But, I mean, within the Hellboy universe. Hellboy in Mexico happened.
Yes. Yes, it did, didn't it?
So it's great. It's like periodically you'll get characters saying, I'm worried about Hellboy. We haven't heard from him in months. Smash cut to Hellboy in Mexico. Just drunk off his ass with a bunch of luchadors.
Yes.
And there's also a great bit of continuity. How, like, the first time he's with 2 luchadors, and then the next time he's just with the one. Because it's like, it's in between the stories where one of those luchadors got killed off. It's nice. It also retroactively makes the reason why Hellboy, like, kind of had his sort of breakdown really, really sad. It's because his dog died, Rob.
Oh.
His dog died, and the B.P.R.D., you know, the organisation, it was basically his family growing up. They've now been pretty much subsumed by the US government, and, like, none of them really have any time for him.
But his
Like,
dog died.
I know, it's really sad. Like, the story starts off, with him trying to talk to Margaret, who's like the main supervisor now. Basically, like, that I wanted to kind of talk to you about Mac, my dog. And she just blows him off saying, oh, yeah, I'm sure you can find someone to look after him. And then you just see Hellboy, like, looking at a photo of his dog and then walking past his grave.
Oh, that's tragic.
Yeah, and I think, you know what the really sad thing is?
What?
There's a bit where, like, one of the guys is going to Mexico with, that, like, two of them, they ask, you ready to roll, big guy? Let's show those Mexican spooks how it's done. And then Hellboy responds, yeah, all right, might as well, I guess. Which is like, that's how Hellboy became Hellboy. Like, the very sort of understated, sort of outwardly shrugs off all his problems. That's where he learned to do that. Because he didn't have anyone he could talk to about how sad he was that his dog died.
Wow.
Oh, that hurt, Rob. That hurt quite a bit.
I'm not surprised.
Luckily, there's some like lighter stuff towards the end of it. Because, as I mentioned, that's the main story. But also we have Hellboy versus Lobster Johnson, The Ring of Death, which is basically Hellboy sitting just at the B.P.R.D. with one of the other agents, where they find... Because in the canon of Hellboy, Lobster Johnson, the famous, like, 40s pulp hero, he got his own knockoff Mexican series, starring one of the luchadors that Hellboy was hanging out with. And in this film, Lobster Johnson fights the devil, and Hellboy plays the devil, complete with, like, not only complete with terrible costume, but also, as we find out, Hellboy was so drunk, they only got 2 shots of him to use in the movie. So it just keeps cutting back to, like, these same shots of Hellboy, and occasionally, like, you see him from the back, but it's very clearly just a man in the costume with a big rubber fist. I also like that added on to that, the Down Mexico Way story, that also takes place on the day that Hellboy is filming this. And it's from the perspective of the visitor. You know, the alien who is monitoring Hellboy.
Yeah.
To see if he really is going to destroy the world. And it's him watching a very drunk Hellboy just falling about a set and thinking, perhaps I was wrong about the subject's potential for redemption after all. And wandering off into the desert.
Oh.
So that's really good. I think kind of the only real complaint I would have is that the main story, like, it has 3 different artists for each of the 3 different stories, and it's 3 very different styles that I find are quite jarring.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
Especially because, like, Mike Norton and Yi-Chan Lee, they've got fairly realistic proportioned styles, whereas Michael Avon Omigs is very cartoony.
Yeah, I can see why the switch would be quite jarring. I've noticed that with these with these collections where they have different artists doing different stories. I think it was the Marvel Strike Force one for War of the Realms had different artists for different stories, and
yeah, like, especially when it's all collected.
Yeah,
I think this is even worse because it's like it's within the same story.
Yeah,
like, it's especially jarring when you've got, like, Vivara. She appears, like, her part of the story, she looks very cartoony, quite anime-esque.
Yeah.
But then she also appears, like, in Professor Broom's part, where she's suddenly, like, much more realistically proportioned, and it's really weird. And not, like, the good kind of weird that you want in Hellboy. But anyway, I think that about does it for us.
You recommend B.P.R.D, Hellboy and B.P.R.D 1956?
I do, yes. It's a lot of fun.
Excellent.
And a lot of sads.
Yeah. But things will pick up for the Big Red soon. We have no doubt.
I mean, and then they're going to go downhill quite spectacularly as well.
Yeah, but then they'll pick up again. Then downhill, then uphill, then downhill. Like any good roller coaster.
And then for parts literally down and uphill.
Yes. Right. Anyway, we are at the end of the show, so we're going to leave you for this week. Thank you again to Luke for joining us for today's episode. If you want to catch any of our previous episodes, or indeed any of the shows that make up our network, you'll find them all on our website, thegeekshow.co.uk. where you'll also find video game reviews and movie reviews and our Patreon as well. If you are interested in getting involved, then send us an email, studio@thegeekshow.co.uk. And if you're listening through any kind of podcast service, we are available on all of them. Then leave us a rating, leave us a review. It does help us with exposure, and it does help us improve. So that's your lot for this week. Until next time, I've been Rob.
And I've been Andrew.
And we will see you all later.
Thanks for listening.